G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now legends, of course, as always, we do have a lot to go over. There was a massive drone attack from Ukraine towards Russia last night. We need to talk about this because, of course, Victory Day is tomorrow, May 9th, so we'll be looking at will there be attacks and also the world leaders who are also attending the event. Now, if you are in Australia, I'll be going live at about 4 to 4:30 tomorrow, which will line up and we'll be live streaming that parade to see if anything does occur. Today we'll also be looking at the maps, a number of geolocations. We'll be comparing maps as there has been some shifts on the map, but I also want to show you some analysis from another military analyst who is slightly different from maybe where we see things happening, but I think he gives fantastic analysis of where the Russian forces may be trying to get through some defensive work. So that's really exciting to look over that too. It's very, very well written. And then actually from the same analyst, there's an article called Fighting to Conclusion. And we're going to then speak about this from the perspective of the negotiation team of the Russians and the war going to a conclusion militarily, with what Vice President J.D. Vance has said about that Russia is just asking for too much. Of course, Russia at this point in time are asking for areas of which they do not occupy. And this gives us a good overview, good contrast between where the Western negotiators are sitting, maybe where Russia is sitting. I think you'll really enjoy that. But today's video is going to be long because there's a lot in that. But we have to start with something that is sad. And sadly, over the past few days, I have lost a friend. Of course, Mr. Christopher Garrett, of course, better known as Swampy. You may remember that I did this video back in 2022 with his team of explosive ordnance disposal guys volunteering to rip out mines and shells, things not exploded, IEDs, booby traps, all of that. And Swampy was a great guy in the amount of holders on and grifters that went in the beginning to Ukraine to try and just better their own financial situation. You had guys like Swampy there really doing the work. Now, what actually has occurred here? Well, this article here comes together with a lot of what that I am hearing. So Sean Pinner, Mr. Pinner, who's been on this podcast, he has said that, of course, Swampy has been killed, and then there was another guy injured, but also another gentleman killed as well while dismantling an IED. Now, 2 of the 3 have sadly been killed. Now, the main Directorate of State Emergency Services of Ukraine in Kharkiv has reported an IED was triggered at a home in Izium. They have said May 6th, an IED, an improvised explosive device, occurred on the territory of a private household in the city of Izium, resulting in the deaths of 2 people and the injury of 1 person. Now, Izium, that has been liberated by the Ukrainian forces in September 2022 and is about 42 kilometres behind the line. So the exact situation here, we won't speculate on what has happened. I'm sure more information will come out, but I'll link that video below of the good work that these guys were doing. The mines, unexploded ordnance, all of that can stay in the ground for decades, well over a century of those well-made pieces of equipment that is area denial and can kill a lot of civilians. Now, let's look at tomorrow, Victory Day, and overnight, so the day before, there's been reportedly 400 Ukrainian drones fired into Russia, a lot of them going towards Moscow. If that is correct, that number, I've seen Russian reports of upwards of 500, those numbers would make it the largest drone attack of the entire war. And we see, again, Photoshop is so good, I don't know, but apparently on one of the drones, this photograph is going around that says Happy 9th of May, Vladimir. We also need to remember that the 9th of May this year, 80 years since then the end of the Second World War in Europe and Berlin, we also need to take into account and appreciate that it was the USSR, it was the Soviet Union. It wasn't just Russia either. If we actually have a look at the soldiers that raised the flags in Berlin, Georgians, Ukrainians, So I think people need to take a step back and actually have a look at, hey, there's a lot of our own guys involved in this as well. Yes, the tensions are there now, but it's still a day to remember Soviet soldiers and the sacrifice made by then the civilians and the Soviets and everything there as well. Now, one of the big things that has occurred from these massive strikes is, of course, this has disrupted air traffic, which you would expect. But I'm now seeing this heralded, quote, as the next collapse because of that disruption. So we'll add that to the list. We'll add it below that Russia's out of missiles and above that Putin has cancer and will die soon. Will we see attacks on Victory Day? I don't think so. I think the propaganda loss for Ukraine alone would be so significant, it's not worth it. Regardless of what was hit on parade, it would not be worth it because, of course, Putin has put out wanting a ceasefire, the way that will be sold, and as well as the legality of the attacks with so many civilians in the area. And you cannot guarantee in that zone, which will have all the air defense and all the electronic warfare that Russia has looking after it, that those are going to be accurate either. So your CIVCAS would be huge. I think all of this that we see from Zelensky through to this is more just saber rattling, because if we were to do a net benefit analysis, I don't think it has a net benefit analysis, like a net benefit to Ukraine at all to have that attack. People say, well, it would show the Russians that this, as we know, if we go back to the Blitz from the Second World War through to the missile attacks we're seeing and everything, attacking missiles over civilian areas, that doesn't have the effect many would think. It actually can pull people together more, and you could see an increase in support of the war as well. And as we have said, Putin says, Kremlin say that one of their goals of this is denazification. Just on the very surface, how does it look? Then attacking a parade, celebrating then the end of the defeat of Nazi Germany. So myself looking at it from an informational perspective, I just don't see that the benefit outweighs the risk and cost here. I think Trump would be very, very pissed if this happened. But the EU, in typical EU fashion, they are trying to stop any of their own or even other leaders, because of course Serbia is not in the EU, from going to this parade. So they're liberal when it suits them, I guess. And we see then, of course, Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico, saying in this video here, addressing that Estonia has denied his plane, well, their plane, then the authority to go through their air zone to go and land in Moscow. And although Slovakia has year-round permissions to do so, they were not allowed. But he says that they will make it, but it has disrupted some meetings. Serbia, they had very similar. The president here has arrived in Red Square, released this video where he says, at least along the lines of, it took me longer than Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin to reach Yalta, but that's the world that we live in now. Of course, Serbia, they are looking for, at least have been looking for, accession into the EU. Many are saying that this will completely take it off the cards. So I guess we will see. But many leaders, they are going, and Xi Jinping, he has also arrived. So we're going to look at the maps, and we do have a lot to go over today and yesterday as well. So here we have Ukraine in the center of your screen. Red areas occupied since 22, purple since 2014. And if we turn then this on, the red check that you'll see on the map today, that of course indicates ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Blue check would be the opposite of this. And where I want to start is I want to start on what we refer to as the Terney front. Now, there is no changes on this map today in this direction, but we have seen a lot around Novye. Remember, it was only a few weeks ago that the front line was around Ivanivki Terney, and this has moved in the direction of Oskil. But of course, just to the south of here sits the Seversk front and Yampil as well. So areas just to keep in mind when we break down this. So let's firstly look around Terney. So this is what is currently moving on the front line. It's come out and expanded. And one of the primary issues that Ukraine had in Kursk was it was never wide enough. It sort of went too narrow and long, so there wasn't enough roads to cross across the border. So you're limited down to a few, and then they can be targeted. So with small advance southwest of Makivka, so just in this direction here, small advancement by the Russian forces according to Syriac maps. And then further, if we take where Novy is sitting, then a further western push just below this Ridkadub as well. So some movement and fluidity on that front line. Now, before we go into the fighting of conclusion bit, of course, south of here we have Siversk, Belhorivka. Now, we do know that Syriac for the past week has been showing some significant advances in here, and I've got a screenshot here, but this is of the Deep State map yesterday, did show some advances to the south of Belhorivka. So we can confirm there's definitely movement on this front. Syriac claims this is much, much larger. Now, on his first update in this direction, Russian army continued advancing between Belhorivka and Hirovka, taking control over serious positions in the forest there. So this is down in this direction right in here, filling in where my cursor is at this point. So movement there on a front line that has been relatively stagnant for some time. Now, another update here, which is just in this Verkhonomayansky as well. So just to the north of here, that the Russians have captured the White Hill the last days of April, and they advanced towards the northern outskirts of here. So that this area, according to him, if you're just traced down where my cursor is, in here, he is saying is moving, filling in. Of course, we had that update yesterday, at least in that direction. So we know there was some movement here. But we have suggested that these two, there's an envelopment in here and try to reach the Oskil here. And what I was reading yesterday was this fantastically put together article here about, no, that's not what the Russians may be trying to do here. Now, this was written a few weeks ago, but just to give you a lay of the land, we have Yampil, Siversk, Yampil, Siversk, Novy, and Novy sits where my cursor is at the moment. Just keep that in mind. Now, what stands out about the Russian bridgehead here is that it not only over the Zedabets, so the waterway in and around Terny, the Russian forces are firmly on the western bank of the river, while the Ukrainian south are still defending far east of it, but that is also most of the Ukrainian-held fortifications in the area. Borrowing from military summary map, which conveniently includes fortifications and earthworks, we can see there is little build-up in the space between Zedabets and Liman. Russian forces breaking out of this bridgehead are entering mostly open space with only a few roadblocks in place. So we have been predicting a more northwesterly push out of here, where he is suggesting no, it may come down to Liman Yampil direction where he has put these due to the defensive works being fairly minimal or light, at least according to military summary. Now, if Russia can parlay the Zedabets bridgehead into an advance to Liman, they can collapse much of the Ukrainian defense on both sides of the river. Not only would they outflank the defense line at Torsky, they roll up the northern bank of the Donetsk, but doing so would precipitate the fall of the Siversk salient. So again, where he's talking about Tursky is here. This is where he says on the eastern side of Zedabets is this direction in here. Siversk has been well defended by the armed forces of Ukraine to this point. We know that even from Russian commanders say that, but it is already firmly in a salient. The capture of Yampil would put Russian forces firmly in Siversk's rear and physically sever the main line of communication. So again, is this what we're going to see in this direction? Well, it is very, very difficult to tell. Liman, Yampil, main lines of communication running down here, already in that salient and potentially moving that front line. So wait out on that. Of course, these are much larger moves that we won't see day to day, but we may see over, 6 months. So let's zoom out, and then we come just to the south of here, and we have what I refer to as Pokrovsk East, Tarasivkia, Nepalivkia, Toretsk area. But we're just going to focus on this area. We'll move to the east of here in a sec. And as you can see, large advancement today, further through Novolenivkia as well. Now, this movement, if correct today, would be on 4 kilometres, which is significant. People say this is insignificant. No, go out on the road, straight bit of road, and walk 4 kilometres. It is a long way. Now, let's have a look at a couple of geolocations around here. Now, we have this flag going up. I can't show you this footage, but I will post this footage on the Telegram if you'd like to see it. We see a Russian attack here. We need to go to 2 minutes 40. That was a bloody good click, guys. And we see a Russian flag going up, which is where the geolocation is in this destroyed settlement. So we can see right out on the edge of here. So it's probably wider than this map is showing. But a few takeaways from this attack. This is a complex attack, a combined arms attack. It uses drones, artillery to soften the positions, and then mounted infantry then break in and with drones fight through the trenches. Now, with any footage, whether it be from Ukraine or Russia, it is edited in a way to show one side. But from what I'm seeing in this footage, it is a huge increase in capability from many of the sort of up the guts attacks, just armoured movements or just recce movements that I am seeing, the use case of different elements and taking of those areas. And as we know, you cannot ever rely on your enemy not then evolving as war goes. And I think there has been a lot of complacency about that with the Russian forces, that people believe, they still believe, Russia in 2025 will fight like they fought in 2022. And that is silly, and that is one of the reasons that we see the attritional warfare like this at the moment moving 4 kilometres. Those that say it is positional warfare not moving, 4 kilometres does not indicate this. Okay, so let's bring up a couple of maps in here. First, Syriac map. Last 3 days, Russian army took full control over Novolenivkia, capture of the trench. So what he's been showing is it hasn't advanced 4 Ks in a day. He's been showing that no, the Russian forces moved into here and then they're just expanding. Now, knowing the Russian forces' movements, what they will try and do is then fatten and widen this so it's not as a small location, 1 or 2 roads, as well as that reduces the saturation of Ukrainian artillery or drones. And we see this then the next day. This movement, Alexander Apil, we can confirm in this direction as well, but also trying to widen that, which I believe will likely be the case, and we will probably see Deep State update that in the coming days. But there was an interesting attack in here. Now, as you know, I report on losses that I deem that are really strategically important, and I do miss a lot because I'm not interested in things just going bang or people being lost. But see, like this ground up here, which I'm guessing is like a mine. This is then 12, maybe 13 kilometers from where the line sat yesterday. So depending on where the line actually was, it may be 10, but let's just say it was 12.8 as I've put out here. What we see destroyed here is a HIMARS system. Of course, a very targetable and important weapon system for Ukraine. We see these HIMARS and then we see them being tracked, and an FPV drone then taking out this vehicle and then it being destroyed and then further hit by drones following. But I do ask that with the range of HIMARS, depending on the load system within them, but minimum within hundreds of kilometres, why it was 13 kilometres from the front line. Maybe trying to absolutely get the most amount of range on a weapon system, or trying to reduce flight time to then reduce the targetability of that missile going out the tube. I don't know, but that would be concerning if I was the commander of HIMARS, seeing one 13 kilometres from the very front line where we know the saturation of drones is wild. So we will come back to here in a second. Do not worry. We need to come up into Kursk. We get a bit of a better idea. Now, I believe this is going to turn a lot of red soon. As I have stated many times, is you have a 10-kilometre push in. That's not all going to be grey. Your grey is going to be a few kilometres. So let's have a look in here, as there has been some pushing around. So Lochnia. This is a very important area, and the further south that Russia has pushed on this front, at least for this year, that last 6 days, Russian army made new advances west of Oleshnia. So we're talking down in this sector across the border where my cursor is at the moment. Okay, so well back from where the blue is showing. But he also said the Ukrainian army recaptured positions at the center of Lochnia as well. So movements in there, just weighed out on this. It's hard to know what's going on. Now, the other day, there was then another offensive across into Tyantyno by the Ukrainian forces in multiple axes in here, but it has seemed to fizzle because people thought this was going to be Kursk 2.0. But what we said is, well, Russia is a lot more prepared than then. So what we do see is to the south of Tyantyno, there has been some confirmed areas of the border, but not like some people were then presuming it would look. The past 2 days, the Ukrainian army launched a series of attacks from these axes. Ukrainian forces managed to enter on the second day the first houses south of Tyantyno. Meanwhile, fighting with the Russian army continues in the direction of these areas with little change. So right on the borders of Novi Put and to the south of Bezalivkia as well. Now, some are reporting that Tyantyno is currently encircled. I haven't seen anything that would suggest that at this point in time, other than cope. So in the same fighting to conclusion, there was a piece about Kursk, which I wanted to go over and show you a couple of things. The world is still adjusting to a new kinetic logic of the powerful intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, strike nexus, which now rules the battlefield. What Kursk demonstrates, however, is that conventional sensibilities about operations are hardly obsolete. If anything, they've become even more important in the age of FPV drones. Ukraine's defeat in Kursk ultimately reduces to well-established rules about lines of communications and flank security. Their early defeats in Kotonovo and Snagost left their western flank prematurely crumpled and thrust them back into a thin logistical chain, which was easy for Russian forces to surveil and strike. That's why Russia's trying to widen areas around Terny, around Pokrovsk, and other sectors. In a sense, drones have made it possible to vertically envelop enemy forces, isolating frontline groupings with persistent overwatch on supply roads. Now, to vertically envelop forces, typically or traditionally, this was used through paratroopers. Okay, so what is a vertical envelopment? Well, a typical envelopment would be, say, Russia push around here and push around here. These troops in here are enveloped. But with drones and then the amount of those that you have, let's say that it looks like this. What a vertical envelopment would typically be, or conventionally, would be paratroopers dropping back in here and have vertically, in a sense, enveloped. But now what can happen is that these can all be targeted in here, I can't draw, with drones, having then a sort of de facto vertical envelopment. And this is what occurred in Sudzha, is you've got two main roads. It was never widened, so you have these two main roads that what we saw and what we reported on was huge amounts of vehicles being lost around these roads, therefore having the impact of basically a vertical envelopment of the forces around Sudzha, even if they were 5-10 kilometers from the nearest Russian lines. This was a feature that was largely missing in Bakhmut, where Russian forces were still preferentially using tube artillery rather than mortars, guns, whatever. But it seems to be a permanent feature on the battlefield going forward, making seemingly antiquated concerns around the lines of communication more important than ever. Drones matter, but the spatial position of forces matter too, so how wide these areas are. So where does this leave Ukraine? They've now blown a pair of carefully husbanded and mechanised packages. One in Zaporizhia in 23, counteroffensive, and now a second in Kursk. In both cases, they were unable to cope with the capability of Russian strike systems to isolate their groupings on the front line. And with Russian surveillance and strikes on rear assembly areas and bases support, their position in Kursk is gone. And they have nothing to show for their efforts, and that is correct in Kursk at this point. The efforts, the losses that occurred in Kursk, with then the Donbass still moving, then the cost in here too, there's nothing to show for it because the negotiations they haven't started yet, and Ukraine's being pushed out of Kursk. Kursk was only useful if the negotiations started while they were still in there. What's important to note, however, is that the Kursk front is not going to be scratched off simply because Russians have ejected Ukraine across the border. In his surprise appearance at the Kursk theatre headquarters, Putin noted to need to create a security zone around Kursk, where we're seeing in Lochnia. This is the Russian parlance for continuing the offensive across the Ukrainian border, and they have in fact crossed into Sumy to create a buffer zone. This will have the dual purpose of both keeping the front active, preventing Ukraine from redeploying forces back to the Donbass, and preempting any attempt by Ukraine to stage forces for a second attack at Kursk. Most likely, the Russians will attempt to capture the heights along the borderline and position themselves uphill from the Ukrainians, replicating the situation around Kharkiv. In short, having opened a new front in Kursk, the Ukrainians cannot now easily close it. For a force facing severe personnel shortages, Ukraine's inability to shorten their front line creates unwelcome additional stresses, with Russian pressure continuing unabated in the Donbass. We are left wondering whether a doomed 9-month battle for Sudzha was really the best use of Ukraine's dwindling resources. So then let's move to then the northeast. Of course, we have Kupiansk and the northeast Dovrychnia, of course, where the Russian forces have been able to successfully in the past months cross the Oskil and expand bridgeheads here. And if we roll back to yesterday in this screenshot on the deep state map, Kamyanka area, that is coming under control by the Russian forces as well. So further expansion there. But let's have a look at this and where these two may be connected as well with the fighting for conclusion. So we see Kupiansk and where this crossing has been. Let me move this across. We'll explain more of this in a second. The critical feature here is the consolidation of a sizable Russian bridgehead north of Kupiansk and west bank of the Oskil. That is the Ukrainian side where I just showed you that move. With Russian forces already positioned on the north-south highway, although this northern front has been a decidedly deprioritised theatre in recent months, as the Russians scratched off the Kursk and southern Donetsk fronts, the placement of Russian forces west of the Oskil creates serious problems for the armed forces of Ukraine in Kupiansk. So just to overlay this map, we're talking Kupiansk and then this area to the west of the Oskil. An advance to the south and west out of the Oskil bridgehead would flank Kupiansk, in combination with advances from the southeast, threaten to collapse Ukraine's salient across the Oskil altogether. Depending on how much combat power Russia commits to this axis, we could see a similar situation to the one we saw in Kursk, with multiple brigades currently fighting east of the Oskil, forced to attempt an ad hoc evacuation across the river as the salient collapses. So like in Kursk, a lot of equipment had to be left behind as an ad hoc withdrawal happens out of these areas, especially across waterways. Their ability, Ukraine's ability to extract heavy equipment, potentially compromised by the complication of the river crossing. So what we can see is a salient has been developed in here from the Pishani front to north of Kupiansk, and that this push may swing around to try and cut that off, and you have the eastern held control side of the Oskil and then the western where Russia has been able to cross. Remember, as we say, large-scale attritional protracted warfare, it's like an organism. It's one growing, moving thing, and something happens up here can impact down here. It's not a series of single actions, okay? It may be for soldiers, but it's not for strategy. Tactical series of single actions. Strategy is putting those tactical actions, victories and failures all into then a strategic picture. So we may see more around here, but you can see there are multiple salients getting made in Kupiansk as well, from Pishani down to Terny, from Terny then down to Seversk, and of course then around Toretsk as well, and somewhat being made around Velikanovosilkia as well. So where are we next? Let's come down into Toretsk, Leonidivkia, Nepalivkia. Now this area has been back and forward a lot according to Suryak map, even over the past months. Toretsk itself, very difficult to get an idea. He says that Ukrainian army, they re-entered the Komsomol suburb northwest of then Toretsk city itself, so up in this direction. Again, it's so hard to know up in here, and some movements around Dashny, Delivkia as well. And then his second update here, that in the last 3 days they re-entered again the centre of Leonidivkia, which we can confirm across these two maps. Again, difficult. I think Toretsk is just going to be difficult until we see like a full occupation of the city. So let's then come just to the north of here, and we have Chassiv Yar, an area we don't hear about that much, but the high points in here are very, very important. And according to Surek, we do have a large gain here. Since the beginning of May, Russian army began advancing at these directions, and the clay quarry taking over most of it. So this is this sector right in here where my cursor is. So if correct, you're talking an area out to about here of about 2 kilometres by, say, 1.1 kilometres. So a fair area in here getting occupied, if correct, and a fair way behind where the line even shows the grey zone on this map. Then let's move down into Pokrovsk itself. Now, no changes shown on this map, but we do see other maps continuing to march on. So let's have a quick look in here. Now, further advancements just out around Utspanivkia, Solone area by the Russian forces, but more where I am concerned about and looking is around this Kotlyrivkia area, this here, that is pushing out and expanding, pushing out and expanding all the way from back when we're at Ukrainska Pushkene at one point. And of course, what this is doing by this dotted line and here is pushing towards Dnipro Oblast, which even informationally is very critical. And Suryak again shows a small movement up in here. Ignore that for the sec, but there's been further expansion of control in these directions, heading in the direction of Horokove as well. And now that they are 2.1 kilometers from that border. So I guess wait out on that and we will see. But we do know there has been liquidity and movement on this front line very recently. Then we have the Velika Novosilka front, where we saw Novopil area coming under control yesterday, confirmed by this map, not Novopil itself, Novopil area. On this front, Russian army secured the locality of Novosilka, so Novosilka in this direction, following the capture of a series of positions east of Zeleny and Novopil. So Zeleny and Novopil, that he says a number of positions are coming under control. And then second update here on this front, Russian army continued advancing towards Novopil and Zeleny Pole. So continuing to move as one, that they have then put positions together and are then moving on those. Sorry, there's a word I was looking for in there that didn't come to my brain. So fighting to conclusion. Will this war end diplomatically? Will we see a deal negotiated? Well, the two sides are just so far apart. Many, including myself, say it is highly unlikely. And I think that the Trump-Vance presidency is coming to this realization as well. J.D. Vance has said, I wouldn't say the Russians are uninterested in bringing this thing to a resolution. What I would say is right now, the Russians are asking for a certain set of requirements, a certain set of concessions in order to end the conflict. We think they're asking for too much. So, of course, you know how much that they are asking for and areas of which Russia don't occupy. But at this point in time, with then the initiative on Russia's side and potentially, and I think likely, the war of attrition on their side. And the reason I've come to that conclusion, although we don't have good numbers, even if we take Zelensky's numbers, that proves by Zelensky's own figures, which will be deflated for Ukraine, inflated for Russia, that Russia is winning the attritional war, that they would say, well, then we will continue on. And this great article here by an anonymous big surge, Ukraine fighting to the conclusion. I sent this across from an academic in the field and said that this is written better than most academics would. Now, there is some Russian bias in this, I believe so, but we need to go through this because I think it really does look at some realistic, realpolitik diplomacy rather than this liberal, idealist, utopian idea of war. So, I've never made any bones about the belief that the war in Ukraine will be resolved militarily. That is, it will be fought to its conclusion and end in the defeat of Ukraine in the east. Russian control vast swaths of the country. This subordination of a rump Ukraine to Russian interests. Trump's self-conception is greatly tied up in his image as the deal maker, and his view of foreign affairs is fundamentally transactional in nature. As the American president, he has the power to force this framing on Ukraine, but not on Russia, which is correct. There remain intractable gulfs between Russia's war aims and what Kyiv is willing to discuss, and it is doubtful that Trump will be able to reconcile these differences. Russia, however, does not need to accept a partial victory simply in the name of goodwill and negotiation. Moscow has recourse to a more primal form of power. The sword predates and transcends the pen. Negotiation, as such, must bow to the reality on the battlefield, and no amount of sharp deal-making can transcend the more ancient law of blood. So in short, saying any deals still need to take into account the battlefield and who currently has the upper hand. This is exactly why then people in the West want to put Ukraine in a position of power, so then they are the sword instead of the pen. All of this is preliminary and perhaps even irrelevant to the main question, which is whether it is possible to negotiate a meaningful peace in Ukraine at this time, or even a temporary ceasefire. This, however, is a much larger hurdle to climb. As I see it, there are 4 structural obstacles to a negotiated peace that Trump has little or no leverage to overcome. Number 1, Russian disillusionment with negotiation and the credibility of Western promises. 2, climbing Russian confidence that they are on track to win a decisive victory on the battlefield. 3, mutual willingness between Moscow and the extant Kyiv regime to engage in direct negotiations with each other. 3, the status of Russian-claimed territories in the Donbass, which are still under Ukrainian control. So these obstacles here are massive where both sides are sitting and where the US is as well. Many of these issues dovetail, but are ultimately linked to the trajectory of the battlefield where the Russian army continues to advance. So long as the Russian leadership believes they are on pace to capture the entirety of the Donbass and beyond, Putin's team is highly unlikely to accept a truncated victory at the negotiating table, so shortened. The only way out would be for Kyiv to cede objectives like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. In many ways, Ukraine's current possession of these cities are the best cards in any negotiation. But for cards to be useful, they must be played. And it's difficult to imagine Zelensky's regime simply giving up cities that it has fought for years to defend. It can be very difficult, too, to convince people to give those up also. But he does make a good point here. For cards to be useful, those cards also have to be played. And if you're not willing to put them down on the table, whether it is Kursk or whether it is de facto, de jure, whatever, then cards are useless in your hand. They're only useful when they are actually being played at the table. So, again, we are missing most of this article. It's very long, but very well written. Fair enough. Ultimately, Trump's transactional view of politics runs into the more grounded reality of what negotiations actually mean. In wartime, the battlefield has a reality of its own that is existentially prior to negotiations. Diplomacy in this context does not serve to transact a fair or balanced peace, but rather to codify the reality of the military calculus. And it's what we've said, that when you have one party in a position of power, one in a position of weakness, it does not need to serve fair or balanced. If Russia believes it is on a trajectory to achieve the total defeat of Ukraine, then the only acceptable sort of peace would be one that expresses such a defeat through the fall of the Ukrainian government and a Ukrainian withdrawal from the east. Russia's blood is up, and Putin seems to be in no mood to accept a partial victory when the full measure is within reach. The problem for Ukraine, if history is any guide, is that it's not actually very easy to surrender. In the First World War, Germany surrendered while its army was still in the field, fighting in good order far from the German heartland. This was an anticipatory surrender, born of realistic assessment of the battlefield, which indicated that German defeat was an inevitability. Berlin, therefore, opted to bow out prematurely, saving the lives of its young men once the struggle had become hopeless. This decision, of course, was poorly received and was widely denounced as betrayal and cowardice. It became a political scarring watershed moment that shaped German sensibilities and revanchist drives for decades to come. And we know what came in those next decades. So as long as Zelensky's government continues to receive Western support and the armed force of Ukraine remains in the field, even if it is being steadily rolled back and chewed up along the front, it is difficult to imagine Kyiv ascending to an anticipatory surrender. Ukraine must choose between doing this the easy and the hard way as the parlance goes. But this is not really a choice at all, particularly given the Kremlin's insistence that a change of government in Kyiv is a prerequisite to peace as such. any successful path to a negotiated peace runs through the ruins of Zelensky's government and therefore largely precluded at the moment. So again, this is building his case for no, the war we fought to the conclusion militarily, not then diplomatically. Russian forces today stand significantly closer to victory in the Donbass than they did 1 year ago. That is objectively true. And the AFU has been decisively defeated in Kursk. They are poised to make further progress towards the limits of the Donbass in 2025, with an increasingly threadbare armed force of Ukraine straining to stay in the field. This is what Ukraine asked for when they willingly eschewed the opportunity to negotiate in 2022. Willingly there, I would put a red line under and some pressure from supporting states. So, for all of the diplomatic cinema, the political theatre we talk about, and the brute reality of the battlefield remains the same. The battlefield is the first principle and the ultimate repository of political power. The diplomat is a servant of the warrior, and Russia takes recourse to the fist and the boot and the bullet. Couple of quotes here to really line up with this, that Karl von Clausewitz is on war, that war is a continuation of politics by other means. Churchill, you cannot negotiate with the tiger when your head is in its mouth. And this is where there is a major difference between how the liberal utopian idealist views see this war, which is dominated in European politics, and then when you get into the defensive offensive realists and how then they see this war. And America sits between the two because publicly America is more liberal utopian in their view at Western movements, but their foreign affairs decisions, they more reflect a more realist approach to much of this. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.